The desert air of Los Alamos was thin and sharp, a world away from the damp, intellectual atmosphere of Göttingen. Dr. Elias Rosenberg stood on a wooden porch, looking out at the rugged New Mexico landscape, a classified file heavy in his hands. Inside that folder were calculations, his calculations, that could theoretically unlock the energy of the universe itself. He was one of the many brilliant minds sequestered here, part of the Manhattan Project. But he was unlike most of the others. 2 years ago, he had been Professor Elias Rosenberg, a theoretical physicist at a prestigious German university. Now, he was a refugee, a man without a country, building a weapon to destroy the country of his birth. The memories were always there, just beneath the surface. The knock on the door in 1938. The sight of his life's work, his books, burning in a pyre on the street while brown shirts laughed. The desperate, months-long journey to America, sponsored by a colleague who saw the storm coming. His parents had not been so lucky. The last letter he received, months ago via a Red Cross channel, said they had been taken to a place called their Scienstadt. He tried to focus on the mathematics, on the sheer intellectual challenge, but the numbers on the page kept being replaced by numbers of a different kind, the ones tattooed on the arms of the few hollow-eyed survivors who had begun to trickle out of Europe, bringing whispers of a horror beyond comprehension. His work was his revenge, a cold, scientific vengeance. Every equation was a bullet aimed at the heart of the Third Reich. Every successful test of the complex implosion device was a step closer to ending the war, to stopping the machine that had devoured his family. But late at night, in the Spartan barracks he called home, he would lie awake and stare at the ceiling. He was a man of science, of reason. He understood the physics, the chain reaction, the unimaginable fireball. He was helping to create a sun on Earth, and the thought filled him with a profound and terrifying dread. He was becoming a god of destruction to fight a regime of monsters. Where did that leave him? The tension at Los Alamos was a physical presence, thick enough to taste. The German war machine had collapsed, but Japan fought on with a fanatical, terrifying resolve. The invasion of the home islands was being planned, and the projections of American casualties were staggering. The gadget, as they called the bomb, was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a weapon being prepared for use. Elias found himself at the heart of the final push. His expertise in neutron reflectors was crucial for maximizing the bomb's efficiency, for ensuring it created the biggest possible bang. He worked in a fever dream, fueled by coffee and a burning need to see it through. He attended briefings where high-level military officials, men who saw the world in grids and coordinates, discussed potential targets. Cities with names like Hiroshima and Kokura were mentioned. They were no longer just names on a map, they were living, breathing places, home to millions of people who were simply going about their lives. One evening, he got into a heated argument with a fellow scientist, a young, brash American who saw the bomb as the ultimate scientific achievement. "Don't you see, Elias," the man had said, his eyes bright with excitement. "This will end all wars. This is the price of peace." The price? Elias had replied, his voice low and shaking. "And who are we to set the price? We are not soldiers. We are not statesmen. We are men who understand the fabric of reality, and we are about to tear it apart." He thought of his father, a gentle man who taught classical literature. He would quote the Greeks, warning of hubris, of the danger of reaching for power that belonged to the gods. Elias had always dismissed it as mythology. Now, standing on the precipice of unleashing a power that dwarfed any ancient god, he understood the warning was real. He was helping to build a weapon that would not just kill soldiers, but would erase cities, poison the land, and haunt the world for generations. Was the death of the Nazi regime worth the birth of this new, permanent shadow over humanity. The clear, clean lines of his revenge were blurring into a gray, ashen landscape of moral ruin. July 16, 1945. 5:29 a.m. They stood on a barren stretch of desert called the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead. The name felt chillingly appropriate. Elias, along with the other scientists, lay face down in a trench, his hands over his eyes as instructed. The countdown crackled over a loudspeaker. His heart hammered against the desert floor. This was it. The culmination of all his work, his pain, his quest for vengeance. The voice reached zero. There was a silence that seemed to swallow the world. Then, a light. Not a light he could describe. It was a light that came from everywhere at once, a blinding, searing whiteness that burned through his closed eyelids and the flesh of his hands. It was the sun, born at their feet. He dared to look up, just for a second, and saw it, a roiling, purple and orange fireball, a living thing of terrifying beauty, climbing into the sky, boiling the very air. The heat reached them a moment later, a dry, searing wave. Then the sound, a primal roar that seemed to tear the sky in two and shake the soul of the earth. That he did not cheer. He did not celebrate. He watched the mushroom cloud climb, an ugly, cancerous stalk blossoming into a deadly flower, and he felt a profound and utter sickness. A quote from the Bhagavad Gita, which he had read once in his youth, sprang unbidden to his mind, spoken by his colleague, Oppenheimer, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." They had done it. They had harnessed a force of cosmic creation and turned it into the ultimate tool of destruction. The war would end soon, he knew. But as he stared at the fading, radioactive glow in the sky, Elias Rosenberg knew that his revenge was complete, and it was utterly, terribly empty. He had helped defeat one monster, but in doing so, he had helped unleash a new kind of terror upon the world, a genie that could never be put back in the bottle. He was a free man, but he was now exiled in a new way, forever haunted by the ghost of a son he had helped to create, living in the long shadow of a dawn he had brought to the desert. The last train from Prague. The castle in Prague was not a castle anymore. It was a shell, its ancient stones pockmarked by shellfire, its grand halls filled with the acrid smell of fear and defeat. It was April 1945, and the Red Army was closing in from the east while the Americans advanced from the west. Inside a crumbling office, SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Richter stood at attention, his uniform immaculate but his soul stained beyond cleaning. He was a disgraced man. His crime, showing mercy. He had refused to carry out a scorched earth order against a Czech village, and for that, he had been stripped of his command and sent to this dead-end post, overseeing the evacuation of a minor research facility. He was a man waiting for the war to end, or for a bullet from his own side. The door opened, and a man in the crisp black uniform of the Gestapo entered. Standartenführer Vogel was everything Klaus despised, a political creature, a fanatic untouched by the front lines, his eyes cold and reptilian. "Richter," Vogel said, his voice like grinding glass. "Your sentimentality has made you useless to the Reich. But it has made you perfect for one final task." Vogel gestured to a large metal crate being wheeled into the room by two SS guards. It was heavy, reinforced with steel bands, and marked with a single, chilling word, Brunhild. "This cargo does not fall into Russian hands," Vogel commanded. "It does not fall into American hands. You will take one locomotive, one freight car, and a skeleton crew. You will travel west, through the chaos, and you will surrender this crate personally to the first American officer you find of field rank or higher. Is that understood?" Klaus was stunned. This was not a mission of destruction, but of surrender. A secret so valuable, even in its death throes, The Reich wanted it in Western hands rather than Soviet. What is it? He asked. Vogel's lips curled into a thin smile. Knowledge, Sturmbannführer. Knowledge that is too dangerous for the wrong hands. Your duty is to ensure it finds the right ones. Fail, and the consequences will be severe. As Klaus saluted and turned to leave, Vogel added one last, quiet threat. And Richter? We will be watching. There are still loyal Germans who understand what must be done. An hour later, the locomotive, a hulking Class 52 Kriegslok, sat hissing on the tracks, its single freight car hitched behind. Klaus stood on the footplate, looking at his crew, a young, terrified engineer named Schmidt, and two veteran soldiers, Bauer and Hoffman, who looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. In the freight car sat the crate, its presence a dark weight. They were a ghost train, running from one enemy toward another, pursued by the ghosts of their own regime. The last train from Prague was pulling out of the station, and Klaus Richter knew it was heading straight into hell. The train moved like a phantom through the dying Reich. They traveled at night, without lights, navigating by the glow of fires on the horizon and the occasional flare of artillery. The world outside was a panorama of collapse. They passed columns of ragged German soldiers, mingled with desperate civilians, all fleeing west. They saw Waffen-SS execution squads hanging deserters from lampposts, their bodies twisting in the wind as a warning. Bauer and Hoffman, the two soldiers, grew more tense with every mile, their eyes constantly darting towards Klaus, judging his every order. They were stopped at a shattered bridge, forcing a long, dangerous detour south. While checking the tracks ahead, Klaus and Schmidt stumbled upon a scene of horror, a makeshift camp where a group of concentration camp prisoners, mere skeletons in striped uniforms, had been machine-gunned by their fleeing guards. Among the bodies, a faint movement. A young boy, no more than 14, was trying to crawl free, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended understanding. "We cannot leave him," Schmidt whispered, his voice thick with revulsion. Bauer stepped forward, his rifle raised. "He is a witness. He is a burden. We have our orders." Klaus looked from the boy to Bauer, to the cold, impersonal crate on the train. This was the true legacy of the Reich. Not some secret knowledge, but this, piles of dead children. He made a decision. "He comes with us," Klaus said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Bauer lowered his rifle, but the look in his eyes was pure mutiny. That night, as the train hid in a forest siding, the betrayal came. Klaus was checking the boy's wounds when he heard the click of a safety being disengaged. Bauer stood there, his pistol aimed at Klaus's head. Hoffman stood behind him, his expression grim. "The Reich is dead, Richter," Bauer spat. "Vogel was a fool to trust a traitor. We have new orders. From a man who still believes in Germany. We are to destroy the cargo. Now." "A man? What man?" Klaus asked, stalling, his mind racing. "It doesn't matter," Bauer said, his finger tightening on the trigger. A shot rang out. But it was Bauer who crumpled, a look of surprise on his face. Behind him, Hoffman lowered his smoking pistol. "I have a sister in Berlin," Hoffman said quietly, his voice steady. "I would prefer the Russians not find her. Now, let's get this damned crate to the Americans." The immediate threat was gone, but Klaus knew Vogel's loyal Germans were still out there, hunting them. They were running out of time, and the most dangerous enemy was the one they had left behind. The final leg of the journey was a desperate sprint. They abandoned the main lines, using forgotten industrial spurs and rural tracks, the locomotive groaning in protest. They could feel the pursuit closing in. A Fiesler Storch spotter plane circled high above them one afternoon, a clear sign that their position was known. They were rats in a maze, and the cat knew exactly where they were. On the morning of May 4, 1945, they saw their goal. In a river valley below, they spotted a column of American Sherman tanks, their white stars a beacon of salvation. But between them and the Americans lay a final, terrible obstacle, a company of fanatical Hitler youth and SS men, dug in around a roadblock, determined to fight to the death. There, Klaus said, pointing to a damaged railway bridge that spanned the valley. It's our only chance. Schmidt, get us across. Hoffman, you and I will cover the boy. The locomotive surged forward, its whistle screaming a defiant challenge. The German soldiers below, startled, turned their weapons on the train. Bullets pinged and sparked off the iron hull. Hoffman returned fire from an open door, his machine gun spitting brass. Klaus, using his rifle with the precision of a former Eastern Front veteran, picked off a Panzerfaust team aiming for the locomotive's boiler. They were halfway across the bridge when a shell from a German anti-tank gun struck the rear of the freight car. The explosion was deafening. The car derailed, screeching horribly as it tore up the tracks, coming to a rest tilted precariously over the river below. Klaus was thrown against the wall, his vision swimming that he crawled into the shattered freight car. The crate, Brunhild, was damaged but intact. He could hear American voices now, close, and the sound of their tanks engaging the German position. With his last ounce of strength, he used a crowbar to pry the crate open. He had to know. He had to see what he had sacrificed so much to deliver. Inside, nestled in packing straw, were not weapons. There were files. Blueprints for advanced jet engines, rocketry, and something called night vision. And a small, lead-lined box containing several grams of a strange, heavy powder. It was knowledge, just as Vogel had said. The seeds of the next war. An American soldier, a young lieutenant, peered into the wrecked car, his M1 Garand pointed at Klaus. Hands up. Come out slowly. Klaus Rosenberg, former SS Sturmbannführer, raised his hands. He was a prisoner. The war, for him, was over. He had completed his mission. He had saved the boy. But as he was led away, he glanced back at the open crate. He had ensured this knowledge would not fall into Soviet hands. But as he looked into the young, confident face of the American lieutenant, he wondered if he had simply helped it find a new home. The last train had reached its destination, but its cargo would fuel the dreams and nightmares of a new world. The Nuremberg Defense. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg stood as a grim monument to a world trying to rebuild itself from ashes. For Captain James Miller, recently of the 101st Airborne, the opulent courtroom felt more alien than the French hedgerows or Dutch canals he had fought through. His war had been one of mud, blood, and simple survival. This new war was one of words, documents, and cold, calculated justice. As a junior prosecutor on the American legal team, his task was to help build the case against the 21 men sitting in the dock, the architects of the nightmare he had helped defeat. That he looked at them now, these once powerful men in ill-fitting civilian clothes. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like bureaucrats, bankers, grandfathers. It was this shocking normalcy that unnerved him most. He had expected to feel rage, a soldier's righteous fury. Instead, he felt a profound, chilling disconnect. How could these ordinary-looking men be responsible for the horrors detailed in the stacks of evidence on his desk, the industrial-scale murder, the slave labor, the mountains of corpses? His specific assignment was to interrogate the documentary record, to link the defendants directly to the crimes. He spent his days in a windowless room, surrounded by captured German documents. He read the dry, administrative language of genocide, train schedules for human cargo, invoices for Zyklon B gas, coldly efficient memos about the economic utilization of human hair and gold fillings. The banality of the paperwork was more horrifying than any battlefield corpse. This evil had been managed by men in offices, men who went home to their families after a day's work of organizing mass death. One defendant in particular held his gaze, Ernst von Leer, a former high-ranking official in the Ministry of Economics. He was an educated man, a lawyer himself, with a calm, intellectual demeanor. He was not a raving ideologue like some of the others. He was, on paper, the most reasonable of the accused. Miller's job was to prove that this reasonable man had knowingly funded the SS machine, that his signatures had authorized the budgets for the concentration camps. It was like trying to prosecute a ghost. The man in the dock seemed a world away from the crimes described in the documents. Captain Miller, the soldier, was gone. In his place was a hunter, stalking the most elusive prey of all, the conscience of a civilized monster. The trial ground on, a slow, painful excavation of a nation's soul. The prosecution began presenting its most visceral evidence. They showed films taken by Allied troops liberating the camps. James Miller, who had seen the real thing, had to look away as the ghastly black and white images flickered on the screen, the piles of emaciated bodies being bulldozed into pits, the hollow stares of the survivors. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Several defendants averted their eyes. But when James looked at von Leer, the man was watching, his face a mask of detached, academic interest, as if studying a fascinating but distant historical phenomenon. Later, during a cross-examination of another defendant, the infamous phrase was uttered, "Befehl ist Befehl." Orders are orders. It was the Nuremberg defense. The claim that they were just cogs in a machine, following lawful orders from their superiors, and therefore not morally responsible for their actions. That night, James couldn't sleep. The phrase echoed in his mind. He thought of his own orders during the war. To take that hill. To secure that bridge. They were difficult, deadly orders, but they existed within the recognized rules of war. The orders these men followed were to exterminate entire populations. Was there no line where personal conscience had to overrule a command? Was a man truly absolved of murder because a piece of paper told him to do it? He redoubled his efforts on von Leer. He found a memo, buried in thousands of pages, a request from the SS for additional funds for special construction projects at Auschwitz. Von Leer had approved it, but appended a handwritten note questioning the cost efficiency of the current crematoria design and suggesting a more streamlined model for greater throughput. James stared at the note, his blood running cold. This was not a man blindly following orders. This was a man actively optimizing the machinery of death. He was not a cog, he was the engineer. When James confronted him with the document in a pre-trial interrogation, von Leer remained calm. "I was managing a budget during a total war, Captain," he said smoothly. "My concern was fiscal responsibility, not the nature of the projects. That was outside my purview." "Outside your purview?" James repeated, his voice tight. "You were signing off on the budget for a factory that consumed human beings, and your only comment was on its efficiency." Von Leer gave a slight, condescending smile. "You are a soldier, are you not? You understand chain of command. You understand compartmentalization. I did my small part for the war effort. I did not design the policy. I merely managed its finances." James left the interrogation room feeling soiled. He had looked into the heart of the modern evil they were trying to condemn, and he had found not a raging beast, but a calm, rational man who had willingly surrendered his humanity to the cold logic of a system. The battle was no longer about proving what had happened, but about proving that these men knew it was wrong. And that was a much harder fight. The day of the verdicts arrived. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with a tense, historical gravity. James Miller sat at the prosecution table, watching the judges file in. He thought of the friends he had lost in the war, of the haunted faces of the camp survivors he had met, of the mountains of documents that had led to this moment. He looked at Von Leer, who sat perfectly composed, as if he were merely waiting for a train point. One by one, the sentences were read. Death by hanging. Death by hanging. Life imprisonment. The words fell like stones. When the judge came to Ernst von Leer, he was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence was 20 years imprisonment. A murmur went through the room. 20 years. For a man who had helped bankroll the Holocaust. James felt a surge of bitter disappointment. It felt like a failure. The masterminds were swinging from ropes, but the efficient bureaucrat, the man who made the machine run smoothly, was getting a prison term. It felt like justice had only been half-served. As the guards led the defendants away, Von Leer caught James's eye. For a fleeting second, the mask of academic detachment slipped, and James saw something else, not remorse, but a flicker of cold triumph. The system had been condemned, but he, the master of the system, had survived. He had used the very logic of that system, compartmentalization, delegated responsibility, as his shield, and it had worked. James walked out of the Palace of Justice into the pale German sunlight. He felt exhausted, emptied. He had come to Nuremberg seeking catharsis, a final, clean end to the war. Instead, he had found a more complicated and enduring truth, that evil could wear a suit and tie, that it could hide behind bureaucracy and legalisms, and that defeating it on the battlefield was only the first step. The harder, longer battle was to root it out of the human heart and the structures of power it corrupted. He had helped make history. He had helped establish that, just following orders, was no defense for atrocity. But as he looked at the rebuilding city around him, he knew the victory was fragile. The Nuremberg defense had been rejected in that courtroom, but he knew it would be whispered in corridors of power for generations to come. His war was over, but the fight for justice had just begun on a new, more complex front. He was no longer just a soldier, he was a witness.